got a lot to cover in this episode, so you may want to grab yourself a scotch and a cigar. But since I'm in the cabin, I got to save the cigar for a little bit later. But in this episode, I'd like to cover some of the basics. I mean, there are so many different styles and types of boats that it would be very difficult to cover all of them here. What I'd like to do is go over some of the basics, and hopefully you've had an opportunity to think about what type of sailing you want to do, where you want to go, and what part of the world you're going to be cruising in. And it's beyond the scope of this series to say which boat manufacturer is better than a boat manufacturer, what size is the best vessel for you. That's part of determining what you want to do and where you want to go and how you want to do it. You know, there's pros and cons to just about everything. Some people like a particular boat, other people don't like it. They think it's a great boat, one of the best built boats in the world, or you know, they could have done a better job. But I tell you what, I like the boat that I'm on. It's an Islander, and Bahama Islander is the model. Unfortunately, these guys went out of business, I'm not sure, I think it was the late 70s, early 80s, and I don't really understand why, because this vessel has got the right amount of fiberglass. Some of the older vessels, well, this is a 75, but before that, I mean, they weren't sure how strong fiberglass was, and it got built up and built up and built up, and the boats became very, very heavy. Then some of the manufacturers said, hey, we're wasting money here. Let's cut back on the amount of fiberglass. Well, some of them cut back a little bit too much, and the hulls and the top sides just weren't substantial enough to do any real sailing in. So there was a period of time there where there was a little bit of a balancing act as to how much and how little to use. Another thing during the construction of sailboats, well, let's talk about, first of all, you can have a fiberglass boat, a wooden boat, a steel boat, and there were even some concrete boats. Now, most of the boats today are fiberglass. Wood is great. I know a couple of people who have wooden boats, and they've had them for years, and now they're just, I've lost my allure for wooden boats. It's just so much work. It's a lot more work than the fiberglass boat for a lot of reasons. But we're going to mainly focus on the fiberglass boats. And when they were laid up, meaning put together, some of them had what's called a solid core, which is all fiberglass. Others have a cord hull or cord top side, and that's where you got a layer of fiberglass. Then you have some kind of corrugated or other material in there. A lot of times it's just balsa wood that's laid in, and then another layer of fiberglass, and that's encapsulated. The problem with that is it makes a lighter boat. It's still strong. However, if you get water intrusion, that core is going to eventually rot out, and you're going to have soft spots. And you see that. I got a boat neighbor here who's got that, and he's cutting a big piece of fiberglass out of the top side of his boat, cleaning it out, and I know some people who've done that, and they've done a very nice job of it. The other thing is, like in the hull, if you're going to put a through hole in, you can't just bolt that, you know, on the through hole you got the pipe coming through, and then you got a nut tightening, or you can't just tighten that up because that is going to compress with a cord hull. So what you need to do is, and basically you take an Allen wrench, and on the short side put the long side into a drill, spin it around, clean all that out, then fill it with a filler compound or a epoxy with fairing compound in it, and then re-drill it. Well, that's a lot of effort, but it's important because you're not going to get a good seal unless you do that. So that's the basic types of hulls. I mean, let's go back again. Some of them are sprayed into a mold. It's a chopped fiberglass and they spray it. Others, it's hand laid up. The same thing though, you got a mold, they fiberglass it, they put the gel coat on first, then a coat of fiberglass, then they start glassing it, and then you just keep building it up from there. So that's the basics on that. Now when we talk about the different types of sailboats, as I mentioned, there are so many variations of everything. But the primary sailboats are the catamaran, which, you know, they say you buy a boat by the foot. The catamaran you buy by the acre. Now the thing about catamarans, yeah, they're comfortable, there's a lot of living space, but because of their width, it's difficult to find marinas that can take you, that have a slip big enough, or even a yard that can haul you. The other thing, talking to some friends of mine who have a catamaran, for the most part they really like it. There are times though, you know, when you're in choppy water, so the first pontoon goes up, comes down, and the second pontoon comes up and goes down. Or you're at anchor and the waves start picking up and they're hitting the underside of the catamaran. Those are just a couple of the little downsides. There's a lot of pluses to it too. I mean, you've got space for solar panels, you've got more living space, you have more floor space. Most catamarans will have 2 engines. Some only have 1, but most of them will have 2. So they're a little bit faster, and because of the 2 pontoons in the water, they're going to go a little bit faster. And a displacement hull like the sailboat, the speed is determined by how much water line you have. The more water line you have, theoretically, the faster the boat can go. So you may want to take a look at some catamarans. And one that you don't see a lot, now I had a boat neighbor, Dan, who had one, a non-such, or it's a wishbone. And those were really popular boats, and they're still around. The idea is, it has a single mast, as you can see here, but then it doesn't really have a typical boom. It's a wishbone. So sometimes these are called wishbone boats. And allegedly, they're easier to sail. And I've been on Dan's boat, and we've been out, and it sailed fine. It was nice. But that's another one to consider. They have a very tall mast, though. Next is a ketch, which is 2 masts. There's a main mast and a mizzen mast. If you've watched Captain Ron, you know what I'm talking about. But where the second mast is, or the mizzen mast is placed, if it's after the rudder post, it becomes a yaw. I don't know why, but that's another type, is the yaw. And probably the most popular and the most boats that you'll see, sailboats you'll see, is a sloop. It's a single mast, and it's got a head sail and the main mast. Now, sometimes you'll see those, and there's like 2 head sails. Well, when that happens, then it's called a solent. I think that's how it's pronounced. S-O-L-E-N-T. Everything's got a different name. And we talked about the yaw. Basically, it's a ketch, but with the mizzen mast further back. There's day sailors, which really don't have a lot of cabin space, or smaller boats. Again, day sailing. And then motor sailors. Now, yes, all sail or most of the sailboats have an engine and motor, but a motor sailor will usually have a bigger engine. It is a displacement hull. It's not going to plane, but it's usually got like a topside cabin, and it is what the name is, a motor sailor. And really, I'm kind of a motor sailor. I sail maybe 70% of the time, 30% of the time I'm motoring. I don't care. I'm out on the water. I'm having fun. There's nothing wrong with starting your engine. I mean, I got a 2-cylinder Yanmar. It burns a half a gallon an hour when I'm at 3,000 RPMs. That's not so bad. I know. It's not the typical type of sailor thing. I never said I was a typical sailor. So that's the basic types of boats. Now let's talk about two things here, really. Your air draft and your regular draft. The air draft is how high is your mast. The draft is how deep is your keel. And this is important if you're going to be going up and down the ICW, Chesapeake Bay, and some of these areas where it's a little shallow. I think the bridge height on the ICW is like 62 feet. That's pretty tall. Most of the vessels I see are somewhere in the 48 to 55 foot range. So that's something to consider. The next and really important one is your regular draft. How deep is your keel? Now I have a 5-foot keel and I can go just about everywhere on the Chesapeake Bay. There are a lot of boats that have a 7-foot keel. They can go most places. And there are some that have a 7-foot draft. They are really kind of limited. And let's talk a little bit now about the keels. All the different types of keels that you can have and what some of the pluses and minuses. Again, plus and minuses. Now I have a fin keel. This boat is very maneuverable. I can back this down and back into the slip with very little problem. Fin keels are easier to maneuver, but they also rock around a little bit. So that's something to think about. And the next one you see a lot of is a full keel. And that's a nice comfortable ride. It doesn't swing around as much, but it's also not as maneuverable because you've got that full keel. And another advantage of that full keel is it doesn't have to be as deep to give you the same stability of heeling over. So that's another important one. Then you have a wing keel. And that is kind of a variation of the fin keel, except at the bottom of it, it has wings. So here again, you can have a shallower draft by having the wing keel and give you the weight that you need to keep the boat. So the wing keel advantage is you can have a shallower draft, but you still have the weight to keep the boat straight up or, not heel as much. One of the issues with that is when you ground, not if you ground, but when you ground, if you don't ground the boat at least once in a while, you've probably never left the slip. But that wing is going to almost be like a little suction cup, and it's going to hold that. It's going to be harder to get off the ground once you go on the ground. And it's not quite as maneuverable as the fin keel, probably similar to a full keel. Then there's the bulb keel. And that, it's similar to a wing keel in that at the bottom you have this big hunk of lead or whatever it is there. That may help you with a little shallower draft, but that also breaks up the water flow and helps you with some speed. Now, I haven't seen one of those on the hard here in quite a few years. I don't see very many of those, but that's another one. Another one that is very popular is the dagger board or the swing keel, and that's where it's a shallower full keel, but then another keel drops down and you can pull it up and pull it down so that when you're in heavier weather you can put that down, and there's not a lot of weight to that. That's not there for ballast, it's there for stability of heeling over in higher winds. Those back up probably as good as any boat. They're stable, they're substantial. The issue with those is the fact that there's a part of the keel that is brought up into the boat. When you dry haul, you need to lower that and clean that up. There's a cable and there's gears. Those have a tendency to jam up. So if you got your keel lowered and you need to raise it, may not be able to. Some people have an emergency hook on there that they can hook onto it to raise it. Or the other way around, you're out in high winds, you need to lower it. You can't, so now you've got to slow down. So those are all factors to consider when you're looking at a boat. And while we're talking about the keels and the air draft, when you're looking at boats with the mast, look at where the shrouds are placed. For example, on my boat, they're on the gunnel, or they're on the walkway, so it's a little tight to get around that. Some of them are right on the edge of the boat, others are strapped to the outside of the boat. What's the purpose in that? Well, the closer you have the shrouds inward, the more you can pull your jib in so that it's tight for faster sailing. Now, if you're not going to be doing racing, I kind of like the idea of the shrouds being on the outside of the boat, and I've seen boaters who've had a boat similar to mine re-rigged it so that the shrouds were on the outside. Now that's a lot of work, because you can't just bolt that to the side of the boat and be fine. I mean, you've got to have that substantial into a bulkhead and build that up a little bit on the inside. You can't just throw a couple of bolts in there. But that's something to look at too, is where are the shrouds, so it's easy to get forward and aft on the boat. Now let's talk a little bit about rudders. A rudder's a rudder. Now there's several different types of rudders. There's a skedge which goes along the keel, and full extension rudders which go along the, again, down along the stern of the boat, but then extend up to the gunnel wall. And there's a spade rudder which is a little forward of the stern and a little aft of the keel. That's called a spade. And then of course you have an outboard one that just kind of sits on the outside of the boat and drops down. Well, while we're on that, let's go ahead and talk about the steering. So you've got the rudder or the tiller like I have. There's pluses and minuses to all of it, of course. The plus to the tiller is you feel everything right away. Very sensitive, you can control the boat well. And when you're at anchor or at the slip, put the tiller handle up, you got more space. I also have an autopilot with it that works just like an autopilot on a steering vessel. Got direction, I can hook it up to the chart plotter to follow a course. I've been using that for 8 years now, never had a problem with it. Now steering. The thing with the steering is it's going to be permanent. So whatever space you have in your cockpit is the space you have. Now some of the wheels do fold in, and I've also seen where people will take them off so that they have more room to move around. But the big thing is, to me anyhow, are all the moving parts. So you're going to have cables and cams. That's one way of doing it. Another one is hydraulics. Both are very substantial, both will work fine, but both have opportunities for some breakdown. I had a vessel once that had hydraulic steering, had a little leak. Holy, all of a sudden the boat's not responding. And I got back into the slip all right, and I started looking around and reading things and talking to people. Look at the reservoir. I don't have enough hydraulic fluid in there. Found the leak, fixed it, no problem. Same thing with the steering. I know some guys who've had cable problems. Usually it's a cable and a chain. It's not difficult to fix. You can adjust it yourself, just need a little patience with it. Now let's talk a little bit about engines. Now there's an inboard engine, which, as it says, the engine is inboard. There's a shaft that goes out to the prop. You can have most sailboats are going to have diesel. A few have gas. Then there's also a on the smaller sailboats you might have an outdrive or an outboard motor. And on even some of the larger boats, there's a thing called a sail drive. That's kind of like a outboard or an inboard engine and an outdrive on a power boat. So the engine is inside, but then there is another drive on the outside under the boat where the prop is. It's not a shaft, it's more of an outdrive. And some of the newer sail drives also pivot and turn so that you can use the engine to help steer the boat. I don't have any real experience with it. I mean, I'm happy with what I have with the direct drive. It's easy to maintain. It's one less thing to maintain. I don't have to worry about the outdrive, changing the oil on that and making sure that everything works with that. So another thing to consider when you're looking at sailboats. And while we're talking about engines, let's talk about props. A lot of sailboats will have, it's one prop, but it's two blades. Then there's the three blade, which gives you a little more balance, not as quite as much vibration. And then to get things even more complicated and more technical is the folding prop or the feathering prop. So while you're sailing and the engine's not running, the prop folds back so there's less drag. Put the engine in gear, the blades come out, and some of them are even to the point where the faster you go, the different the pitch changes. So on the fixed prop like mine, the three blade, I can't change the pitch of those blades. Same with the two blades. Whatever it is what it is. However, with the folding prop, most of them anyway, you can adjust what the pitch is. Depending on your vessel, you may want more or less pitch. Just one more thing to think about. And while we're talking about cruising around and anchoring out and going places, you got to take a look at the cockpit. What type of cockpit is it? You know, is it just an open cockpit like what I have? And that's the typical one. There's also a center cockpit, a little bit forward of the aft, and usually those will have an aft cabin on the interior. And they're built up a little bit more so you have more protection from wave action and splashing. You have a dual steering. So on some sailboats, there's a steering wheel on the starboard side and the port side, so that if you're heeled over to one side or the other, you can jump on the other side to steer instead of being right in the middle. And those are usually on wider vessels. And then there's the open transom, all the way together. I mean, there's sometimes they're called a piano. I don't know why. It's just all open. And a variation of that is the station wagon or opening transom, which when you're sailing, the transom comes up like on a station wagon, you know, the back half comes up a little bit. And then when you're at the pier, you can put that down and you have easier access on and off the boat to the pier. Now, we're not going to get into a lot of the interiors. There are so many different interiors. But a couple of things that I think are important to know about is the sleeping quarters. Like usually in the aft, it's called a quarter berth. It's because it's small. You can kind of crawl in there. That's what it is. V berth, the bow of the boat, where there's a berth that you can sleep in. And then there's also cabins areas. Well, one thing when I was looking at boats, and and I've thought about maybe getting something bigger here, but after looking, I decided what I've got is really what I need, is where is the mast and how is it put onto the boat? And we'll talk about that right after this. So sometimes you'll see the mast coming down into the salon area or into the cabin area, and other times, like on my boat, you don't see a mast post anywhere in the cabin. And that's because the two ways that they attach a mast to a sailboat, at least the two that I know of. One is called a keel step. That's where the mast comes through the top of the boat into the boat and is rested on a post and the keel. So, keel stepped. The other one is a deck step, which I have, and there's there's a plate that goes on the deck. It's covered with fiberglass, a little bit of a ring around it where the mast can sit, but then that's also supported down to the keel off of a bulkhead similar to mine. Here you can see this wooden post. At the top of that is where the mast is sitting, and it goes down to the keel and it's on the bulkhead. The only issue with the keel step is making sure that on the outside you have a good waterproof ring around that so water doesn't drip down and eventually make a mess in the bilge of the boat. And I think a key thing in looking at boats is knowing what your skill level is and your time and your budget to work on a boat. Are you comfortable working with fiberglass, with the engine, with the sails, with plumbing, with electrical? You don't have to be an expert at any of these things. You just have to be willing to learn and take some time to learn, or even have the time to be able to do the work yourself. Doing the work yourself is that when a problem comes up, you're out at anchor, you're out at sea, even if you're at the marina, you can fix it because you know your boat pretty well at that point. I mean, if you've rebuilt a lot of the systems, you know what's going on. You've had first-hand experience with it. And I think that's important. If you can do a lot of the work yourself, first of all, you're going to save a lot of money, but then you're also going to be a better skipper because you understand your boat better. And keep in mind, bigger is not necessarily better. A lot of times bigger is just more expense. If you think you want to get a boat that is going to accommodate the whole family and all the grandchildren, and now all of a sudden you're up into a 50-foot motor sailor or something like that, and the kids come and visit once a year or twice a year, is it really worth all of that? Probably not, because a lot of marinas have motels nearby or have them right on the property. You go out sailing, all right, at anchor it's going to be a little tight, but for a couple times a year, is it really worth all that extra money and effort to have that big a boat when something a little bit smaller is comfortable for you and your wife and a couple of people? You're comfortable at handling it. And keep in mind, as I said earlier in the other one, buy your second boat first, because you will outgrow the first boat in a short period of time. Okay guys, so this whole process may sound a little daunting and difficult, but buying the boat is not difficult. I mean, buying a car or a truck can be more difficult than this. Again, you just take things in little steps and it all comes together nicely. You may want to speak with a broker or two. Talk with a couple of brokers. They can help you out in a lot of areas. If you find one, or not if, when you find one that you like and you trust, you feel comfortable with, stay with that person, because they're going to know your likes and dislikes. They're going to be able to call other brokers, find out a little bit more about that boat before you drive 4 hours or 5 hours to go see it. It's worth checking out with a couple of brokers. I mean, you can get online, you can look at the boats on Yacht World or whatever it is, and you say, wow, that really looks great, and da-da-da. You get there and, man, is it disappointing. Or the other way around, you look at it and you go, oh, man, that's going to be a lot of work. And you get there, it's not as bad as it looks. Brokers can help you with that ahead of time. And in our next episode, we're going to talk about in a little more detail some other things to consider besides the basic size, type, and shape of boat that you're looking at. So until next time, happy and safe boating to you, your family, and friends, and have an enjoyable time looking at boats.